Assalamualaikum everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in this episode. This, I guess, individual review. Yeah, this individual review on the Collectors Admiralty. Same location, this time a new book. Paradise Lost by John Milton. Specifically, Paradise Lost as published in 1955. The first one, technically a reprint of 1955, first published in 1926. And this basically contains a small little interesting thing. This map essentially of how John Milton perceived the world, heaven essentially, in the context of his poem, this very famous poem. And they actually talk about how this front piece is influenced by Jacob's Ladder and how Dante's Divine Comedy and so on, these aspects actually influenced it. And this book, like, basically you do need to commit yourself if you want to actually go over through this book. And I'm not saying that in the sense that it's not for everyone, far from it. Just as is the case with most poetry or books written of a specific time frame, like William Shakespeare's The Henriade by William Shakespeare. This is kind of the same thing in that context. You have to commit your time in order to appreciate it. Reading it is fine. You could read through the entire book. As far as this particular book is concerned, it contains all these reference materials and glossary, and essentially if you just read it without bothering with the glossary, right, it's roughly, yeah, it's page 236 from, yeah, page 1 to page 236 covers the entire poem itself. So 236 pages, this size. And the rest of these are just glossaries, and the introduction is about 20 pages. It's pretty good. Like, definitely recommended from my side. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forlorn tree is brought death into the world, and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woes with loss of Eden, till one greater man restores us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and the earth rose out of chaos. Or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloah's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song. It's that sort of a book, that sort of inspirational evangelicism, essentially. Although it doesn't change the fact that yes, it is the kind of work which defined an entire generation of English literature. It is nevertheless written by someone who's, for all intents and purposes, as far as I've read, as far as I've gone through his overall history, he was a hypocrite. He was basically a politically minded, dubious character, not someone to talk home about, unfortunately. And not, well, it is a good book, provided you divorce the book's contents and the book's overall presentation and the fantastical imagery that John Milton presents in this work. If you have to divorce it from the fact that the man himself had a very boring name and was a hypocrite as a person. So it is not for everyone in the sense that you must commit yourself to the content in the work itself, and yet once you do, it is endlessly quotable. This is the book actually from where we got better to reign in hell than to rule in heaven. This is actually from where we got that quote. And there are other quotations as well if we were to actually talk about them. Like, thick as autumnal leaves that strew the brooks in Vallombrosa, tears such as angels weep, definitely tears such as angels weep, shone like a meteor streaming to the wind. Like, these all come from here. It is just as quotable as Shakespeare. Again, you need to divorce the author's overall biography and all his actions from the book itself. But this isn't the only book I'm going to be talking about today. There's also Rosemary Rowe, The Chariots of Calyx, and it's basically a series of novels, a part of the Libertas Mystery series. Actually, think Hercule Poirot but Rome, or Sherlock Holmes but Rome. So it's that aspect. So it uses the whole Roman Britain paradigm. No, not paradigm. Technically, it uses Roman Britain as a platform to explore the area itself, to explore the history of Rome in Britain at the time, how Rome actually influenced the way we view the world. And because it's a mystery novel, it specifically talks about how investigations used to happen at that time. Again, investigations don't have a lot of weight at that time. When they did, they were mostly seen as just lip service. They weren't, mandatory or done in the right proper way. Having said that, definitely a book I'd recommend. Any book by Rosemary Rowe, specifically about the Libertas series, is recommended from my side. Partially because she does her research. She's basically like Colleen McCullough in that regard, that she has used sufficient number of references, sufficient number of vernacular indices in order to paint a picture of Great Britain, and Great Britain at the time of the Roman conquest, before it was Great Britain, so colonized Britain, if you will. If you can get a copy of it, hopefully you should. Some of her works are available at Reading Point. You need to go over to Reading Point in order to actually find these specific novels. And if you do, recommend it. I'm not going to spoil anything from it. All you need to know is that Libertas is the main character who carries forward the story. He was a slave, now he's a freedman, an actual freedman, not Gordon Freedman, although freedman does trace its roots from this aspect, a man who was freed. So Libertas basically is under the employ of his Roman master, and he basically is told this is something which happened and this was what was observed, and so with the blessings of his master he goes around and finds information and sorts it out actually. And this is more in the British tradition. That's why I used Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. I could have gone with Alex Delaware, the Jonathan Kellerman's creation and his whole book series, but that's more gritty American detective stories, much more in tune with real life, I guess, with how real detectives in general work their thing. All the same, definitely worth having. This is where we're going to head over to our next book, which is a vintage stuff, A History of India, which was from 1957. Was published, it was reprinted in 1957 by Macmillan and Co. It's basically from the Lahore book date, 465 The Mall, Lahore, back when that place used to be around. Then it's definitely something to keep in mind. That is something you need to keep in mind, because fundamentally that was the shop which sold this book. It was published in Madras, all this name, and it's a history of India as the English had seen it or had researched it. And I say it in quotation marks because they had shared their references. They obviously talk about the root causes from where the wheels of history turned. You just need to keep in mind that the context of using vernacular text in order to provide a historical reference and background, that is dependent on the author. Not all authors used it, and it wasn't used all the time. Because it was originally published in 1926, we need to keep in mind that maybe the author used vernacular references because it had gone out of fashion for a small duration, only to come back into fashion again, since the people of the British Indian civil service had mutually agreed that referential justification is what gives them credence, what gives them authority on the topic. And it's in that context, it's definitely something to read. It's not exactly in the best condition, as can be seen by some of the way the pages go out. Having said that, it's definitely something important because it actually does talk about a lot of aspects in it. It really does give a very, very significant overview of all the major events which happened in Britain at the time, how the Dutch came over, the early French, the Portuguese, all the major names who were involved in this part of the world. So in that sense, it's definitely something to take into consideration for at least initial appreciation of who were the key players in this part of India. When we talk about the East India Company, usually the assumption is that we're talking about the EIC, or the British East India Company, or the English East India Company. That's not true. There was the Dutch East India Company, there was the Portuguese East India Company, there was the French East India Company, there was the Danish East India Company, and all of them had a role to play in these parts of the world. In fact, the Danish East India Company existed here in India. I'm surprised they don't mention it in this book. They really ought to. Maybe because it was the common narrative, so they brushed it aside. It doesn't change the fact that it is something to acknowledge that there was a Danish East India Company here. They had offices in Bombay, and basically the East India Company at the time when the first settlements were established by the company itself, they were told very explicitly that the mandate is only for trade. The mandate is only for trade and commerce, not settling there. You can't allow missionaries to enter into the area because that will jeopardize with trade. You are only going to trade with them, and you are only going to do explorations that expand this trading network. So we are establishing ourselves in India as traders, later as conquerors, in order to monopolize on how these systems will suit us. But the Danish were there as well. The Dutch were definitely the standard that most of these East India companies followed, because the Dutch, they did not just conquer, they ensured that their monopoly remained steadily in their hands. There's a reason why they were far more affluent than the British East India Company. Not something to take lightly at all. And maybe one of these days I might actually read from this book, just to give you an idea of how extraordinary the work is. It's written in such a way that you don't have references per se, but you know where the references come from, because the indices are definitely added in, and the person gives an overall view of the system here. Interesting that they talk about it in the context of India specifically, but not in the context of India and Pakistan both. They do, however, give significant background on how the on how essentially India was ruled and held into account and such. Which is where it's fascinating that they don't mention their references. Again, as I actually talked about, that vernacular references were not taken into account. This book is fundamentally a recommendation for school children because it's meant to be used within, I guess, their schools in Madras in order to uphold the national, the national narrative, if you will, to maintain strongholds in that time. Maybe it was even in the courses offered in the Cambridge school system or the Oxford school system or the London school system to train people who were going to go to British India, probably in the later stages when India and Pakistan had become divided. They had made their constitutions, they had established themselves. However, Pakistan at the time was writing its constitution, so it was technically, we had the Royal Armed Forces, we had those entities, and until the constitution was written, they were under English rule, essentially, just till they got on their feet. And still, I don't think you'll be able to find this book anywhere. This is exclusively for the Collectors Admiralty. But all the same, maybe I'll read it aloud and make an audio book about it, talk about it in detail as a proper book, as a proper work of fact, I guess. And we look into it, we look into it the same way that small channels tend to do, because small channels are dependent on subscribers who like and subscribe their channel, who click on the bell icon and make sure that they follow the works that are published by the small channels, especially considering that small channels have vintage stuff like this and this too, definitely in better condition than A History of India from 1957, even though it was reprinted around the same time. I guess at the end of the day, it depends on how much love you put into the works overall. And with that, I'll bid my leave, because loving a work is important, but you also need to also take time out to make sure that the world knows what you're going through. So take care. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for watching this video. Ciao.